Alright, so now we are finally on La Problema de Tejas, El Hija, or for those of you taking French, why can't I read this? And it's going to start off with the election of 1844. This was a campaign between two very good candidates around significant issues. The Republic of Texas was actually an independent nation at this time, and Texas is going to play a large role in U.S. history in the first half of the 1800s. The acquisition of Texas is actually going to affect the coming of both the Mexican War and the Civil War. We were starting to become concerned about the future of Texas. Slavery was an issue, but we also didn't want them to become friends with Great Britain. This was also related to the concept of manifest destiny. Destiny, of course, meaning fate or future as determined by fate. Manifest is a tricky word, but it means obvious or apparent. That's the meaning that we have here. A manifest can also be like a ship's manifest. All the items that you can have on a ship, or the UPS man has a manifest. But for our purposes, it means apparent or obvious. So manifest destiny is what people believe is the obvious future of the United States. So from the Puritans, remember, we have this idea that we are special and that we are on a mission from God. This is part of the Puritan character that is so instilled in us, and we think it is our destiny and that we should sweep all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. But there is another issue here, and that is of territorial expansion and the issue of slavery. Everyone agreed that we should expand, but some wanted slavery to expand with it. Of course, the South wants slavery to expand. Southerners were feeling attacked by the rest of the country. Remember, by this time we have the rise of those radical abolitionists. Texas is going to become a hot issue here. We also want Pacific ports. We want to sell things to China because we were always looking to China as a great attraction. However, the focal point is going to be Texas. So, as we recall, the Spanish began wandering around Texas in about 1530, and Coronado and De Soto were there by the 1540s. The Spanish, of course, settled in what we think of today as El Paso, Texas, and they made that a base to push into New Mexico up the Rio Grande Valley by the early 1600s. And by the 1700s, the Spanish had established other pueblos and missions, such as San Antonio. So take a look at your chronology sheet there. First, just a second, and pause this, take a look. However, given the hostility of the Native Americans in Texas, Spain's hold on Texas was never as firm as New Mexico and Florida. Mexico is actually going to rebel against Spain in the early 1800s, and by 1821, Mexico is going to win independence. And in the first half of the 1800s, Mexico consisted not only of the area that we think of today as Mexico, but also parts of the U.S. that we know as California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, portions of Colorado. So Mexico essentially, so this was all Mexico, all of this. And Mexico was essentially twice as big as it is today. On paper, Mexico looks like a very big nation. It's actually almost the size of the U.S., the area east of the Mississippi plus the Louisiana Purchase area. But Mexico, like most new countries at this time that had gone through a revolution, had a very unstable government. And consequently, controlling outlying areas was a big problem. So, for example, by the 1830s, California was part of Mexico mostly in name only, as the governors and people of California pretty well ignored most of what was coming out of Mexico. The Mexican government in the 1820s had a heck of a time, or un heco de tiempo, controlling and safeguarding Texas and its frontier. With hostile natives roaming around at will, the Mexican government also hoped to stabilize Texas, but they could never get to it. They saw Texas as a key province of Mexico because of the fact that they were the sort of buffer zone between Mexico and the United States, and there were a lot of Native American tribes living here that they were seeing as very hostile. So in the mid-1820s, there was a progression. A couple of Americans made a very interesting proposal to the government of Mexico. These two Americans were father and son, named Moses and Stephen Austin. Here's Moses, and here's Stephen. And they made a deal with the Mexican government. Basically, the idea was that American settlers would get free land from the Mexican government and encouraging them to settle and thus pacify Texas. And in return, Americans had to do three things. Number one, become citizens of Mexico. Number two, become Roman Catholic, the official religion of Mexico. And number three, own no slaves. Mexico had outlawed slavery well before the United States did. Okay, so things go well at first, except for a few small details. While most Americans who take up land in Texas raise their right hand and become citizens of Mexico, quote unquote, they aren't really Mexicans because they still thought like Americans and had American attitudes. Second, while most went through the motions of becoming Catholics, the motions being mostly, oh yeah, I'm Catholic, now go away, they remained Protestants who, like many Americans at the time, hated or distrusted Catholics. And last but not least, most Americans who went to Texas came from the southern United States, and many of them owned slaves and sought new lands on which to grow cotton. Eastern Texas is actually perfect for growing cotton, so these people are going to bring slaves with them. I know, you're probably thinking, hey, Texas is all flat and ugly and brown and desert-like. I've seen it on TV shows, and that's what it looks like. Ah, pobrecita, you are a victim of Hollywood. West Texas is brown and flat and ugly and mostly desert, but East Texas is green and beautiful and fertile. So there were lots and lots of people willing to come, grab their slaves, and head to Texas to grow cotton. But you are saying, but the Mexican government said you couldn't have slaves. Right. We also said that the Mexican government could not exert much control over what went on in Texas by the first place. So, here's what it looks like by the early 1830s. We have several thousand Americans who are nominally Mexican citizens, but who think and act like Americans, who are nominally Catholic, but are still really Protestants who distrust Catholics, and who are not supposed to own slaves, but are doing so anyway because they want to, and the Mexican government can't do anything about it anyway. So basically, the Mexican government's not doing anything, and Americans are essentially out there in Mexico being Americans who claim that they are Mexicans, and they claim that they're Catholics, but they're not, so no wonder Texas is going to look so attractive to so many Americans. It was like the American version of paradise at that time. Go do whatever you want without interference or control from a government. And they didn't even have barbecue sauce yet. Alright, well, as long as the government allows them to keep doing their own thing, this will be fine. But should that government move to exert some control, there will be trouble. You might think, aha, sounds like the colonies in Britain after the French and Indian War. You are on top of it. So we're about to see the same result. Anyway, in 1835, the Mexican government was overthrown again, and General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was the dictator of Mexico about 9 different times, is going to take control. He promptly suspended the Mexican Constitution of 1824 that had made the people of Texas, then called Texicans, no joke, they're not Texans, they're Texicans, revolt. So the Constitution is gone, the people of Texas are going to revolt. So who is this new bozo making himself a jefe grande for life? We're not putting up with that jive. We don't need no stinking dictator. So, notice the American attitude floating up here? This is how the Texas Revolution of 1835 to 1836 began. Clearly, you'd think that Santa Anna had the advantage, and he could suppress a few thousand revolting Americans/Texicans. Well, yes and no. You'd have also thought that Great Britain could suppress the colonies too, right? Well, Santa Anna had to get his army together, march up into Texas, etc., etc., and in the meantime, the Texicans are preparing to fight, and the commanding general of the Texas forces is a man named Sam Houston. Houston is a very interesting character. He had actually long been a very close friend of Andrew Jackson and had even been a U.S. representative from Tennessee and governor of Tennessee in the 1820s. However, Houston's wife suddenly left him in 1829, and a heartbroken Houston resigned as governor and actually moved in with the Cherokee Indians for several years. He had long been friendly with the Cherokees, and they did accept him, and they soon gave him the affectionate nickname of Big Drunk, which tells us how well Houston dealt with his wife leaving him. By 1834-35, Houston was wandering to Texas, and he was the right man at the right place at the right time. He was a really big man, especially for the time, 6'5", handsome, a great public speaker, and in his early 40s, and he demonstrated a leadership talent. So it is really not surprising that he is going to become the leader of the Texas rebels. Houston began with an army of only 400 men, while Santa Anna was approaching with thousands, but Houston set about to build and improve on these Texas forces. In the meantime, the Texas forces were not doing well dealing with the Mexicans. By late March in 1836, in fact, the entire revolt was about to fail, as the Texans had sustained two very serious defeats in the Battle of Goliad. You can see that on your chronology sheet, and at the Alamo. At Goliad, 400 Texans were defeated and surrendered as prisoners of war, but under orders from the Mexican government, they were massacred by Mexican troops. At the Alamo, an old Spanish mission in San Antonio, you can still go see it today, maybe some of you have, 187 men, including the famous Jim Bowie, inventor of the Bowie knife, and the equally famous frontiersman Davy Crockett, held off several thousand Mexican soldiers for over a week. However, in the end, the Mexican troops captured the Alamo and killed all of the defenders. And while these defeats and massacres, of course, terrified the people of Texas, these defeats also sent the message that the Texan troops might well fight to the end, as they would end up dead anyway if they were defeated or surrendered. So Houston is going to plan his counterattack very carefully, and on April 21st, 1836, his small army of several hundred men struck Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Texans routed the surprised Mexicans and actually captured Santa Anna. And at gunpoint, Santa Anna granted independence to Texas. You know, his mother didn't raise a fool. And then he was released back to Mexico. The Battle of San Jacinto is so important that today, right to this minute, there is still a ship in the U.S. Navy, actually named the USS San Jacinto, and in this, so that's sort of your fun fact. And so in the spring of 1836, Texas had won independence, and the Texans are whooping and a yeehaw and making all those Texas noises. But independence is great, and anyone with a brain knew Mexico might be back, and Texas might not be so lucky again. Houston is immediately going to send a message to President Andrew Jackson, who was his old pal, asking Texas to be annexed by the United States, which was a very good move. Well, Jackson loved the idea of expanding the United States frontier, and in fact, he had long believed that Texas was technically part of the Louisiana Purchase. He was, however, completely wrong about this. You're probably thinking, well, slam dunk here. Jackson and Houston are tight. Houston wants Texas annexed. Jackson wants Texas. Let's just get out the champagne, or more likely the Lone Star beer, and wait for the party to start. But that's wrong. So why? Okay, so let's think back to Jackson. Okay. Searching memory banks, searching memory banks. Hello, presidential election year 1836. He is about to leave the White House and he wants to get Van Buren elected. But this is where the problem comes. When it looks like the U.S. might annex Texas, people such as William Lloyd Garrison and other radical abolitionists went ballistic, total hissy fit, saying this would expand slave territory in the United States. And they were right. Now, I know we read and talked about Garrison and his cohorts and what they believed, so we know that he was very outspoken, and the abolitionists were very outspoken, although very tiny minority. Nevertheless, because they could and would kick up such a fuss on the slavery issue, Jackson hesitated to stir them up on a presidential election year. So as a result, Jackson sends a letter to Houston basically saying, hey, Sammy, you know I love you, baby. You know I want Texas, but Garrison and all of those guys will raise such a stink that I can't risk it in an election year, so I can't go there. Sorry. So now you're probably thinking, what? Jackson was afraid to stir up the slavery issue in 1836? Are we talking about the same guy, Andrew Jackson, who had survived as an orphan teenage prisoner of war, who kills people in duels even after he's been shot near the heart, who faces down South Carolina and kicks butt everywhere? Yeah, that Andrew Jackson. He's saying, oh golly, don't want to stir anything up. So stop and think about it. If Jackson is unwilling to rock the boat on the slavery issue in 1836, does that tell you that this issue is already pretty touchy? So even if Jackson didn't want to go there, it's so touchy that Jackson doesn't want to go there in the election year. And this tells us that we are looking at a room full of dynamite when even Jackson won't go there. And of course, this is only going to get worse, but for now, what about Texas? So, Houston gets the bad news that Texas is on its own, and the Texans promptly organized Texas as an independent nation called the Republic of Texas. So yep, Texas is an entire nation unto itself, just like the United States of America. And of course, while the U.S. recognizes Texas's independence, Mexico's not happy about it. And they make noises about Texas still being a province in revolt, over which Mexico will reassert its control at some point. By the early 1840s, although recognized as independent by Britain and France, Texas's finances were very weak, and the hope of being annexed to the United States returned to the forefront. Mexico is swearing that they are going to come back and take Texas all over again, and there is fear that Texas could actually become an ally with England if the U.S. doesn't annex with Texas. So by 1844, the U.S. has to do something about it. So this is where we come back to that election that I mentioned in the beginning of the slide. So you should make a little note in your notes here that says, like, this is the issue, and we're coming back to it. So the Whigs are going to go with Henry Clay, who, yes, is getting pretty ancient by now. He was a slaveholder, and he doesn't want to rock the boat. I mean, hello, his name is the Great Compromiser. He still wanted to find a way, though, to stop slavery and make the nation work. He actually did free his slaves in his will and was very concerned with the state of the Union. He tried to be cautious and not say anything on the issue, but being too careful is almost as bad as doing nothing, and we're going to see that come up here. Democratic leaders go visit Jackson and ask him, who do you think should run? And his response was James K. Polk. James K. Polk is our first example of a dark horse candidate. Basically, someone who you would not expect to win. He wasn't really unknown. He was Speaker of the House and had been Governor of Tennessee, but he was not as much of a national figure as Clay. And Polk's position was, let's go get Texas, and while we're at it, Oregon too. There is no such thing as too much land. Polk is going to win the election, but it is actually very tight. There's going to be 1.34 million popular votes for Polk and 1.3 million popular votes for Clay. We're also going to see the Liberty Party. That's going to be our third party candidate, and they were organized in 1840. Their issue was the anti-slavery platform. They get 62,000 votes total, which is actually significant because that amount may have lost Clay the election. But the expansionist idea wins with Polk, and Henry Clay is going to be torn. Clay holds the Union as most dear, and he doesn't want to risk basically this jeopardizing and dividing the nation. He doesn't want slavery to be the dividing factor. He was very wishy-washy, and because of that, he just couldn't quite sell himself to the people. Polk is elected in November, becomes president in March, but Tyler is still president. So take a look at your chronology sheet here. So Tyler is going to encourage Congress to annex Texas as he is a Virginian. But, because remember, think to yourself, what does it mean to be a Virginian? So you're from the South, so you're going to have more of that expansion of slavery perspective. But the problem to annex another country is that this requires a formal treaty between two sovereign nations. However, there is no way this treaty will be ratified by the Senate. Think back. I mean, if Andrew Jackson wasn't going to do it, this is a very tricky maneuver. So they are going to do something very tricky here. A joint resolution to annex Texas. This is where the House and the Senate come together and they make something called a joint resolution, and that requires instead a simple majority in each house. So 50% plus 1. Going through separately would have meant a 2/3 majority in each house, and that would not happen because of the slavery issue. So now Texas is annexed. Tyler is going to leave office, and the whole problem will get dumped on Polk. Poor Polk. Mexico had also, in the meantime, told the United States that if we try to annex Texas, it will mean war. Mexico immediately breaks off diplomatic relations with the United States, and by 1845, this is a big deal. The United States had indeed done something kind of stupid and pulled a very he pulled a very dubious maneuver. Mexico, though, isn't smart either, and we're going to see some stupid maneuvers that culminate in war. Polk is actually rated well, though, overall for a first-term president, because he did have 4 specific goals. His first goal as president was to lower the tariff, and then his second goal was to reestablish an independent treasury system, so smaller banks and no bank in the United States. And he also wanted to settle the Oregon question. Now, the Oregon question was a big question, and around 1800, 4 countries actually had claims on Oregon: Spain, Russia, Britain, and the United States. By 1830, Spain and Russia were out of the picture, and it's going to now come down to the United States versus Britain. We actually sort of have joint custody over the region. And in the 1830s, Americans are going to catch Oregon fever and start moving to Oregon to settle. This slows down during the Van Buren administration, but then is going to pick up again. His slogan is Polk's slogan is 54-40 or fight, relating to the position of it on the map. We want all of Oregon territory up to 54 degrees 40-minute marks. Kind of nuts, but this is one of his slogans, and we don't need problems with Britain when we have problems with Mexico. By 1846, though, we actually reach a peaceful resolution. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty set the boundary for the whole United States at 49 degrees, so we just decided to continue that line and zip it all the way across over to Oregon. But then we still have now the problem with Mexico. Relations with the United States and Mexico are not that good. We also want California, too. We want it bad. Our first order, though, was to go capture Mexico. So we are actually now going to go to war with Mexico over this. And by 1842, a man named Commodore Jones actually goes to Monterey and captures Monterey, which was at that point the capital, and claims California, but quickly gives it back. Polk attempts to send a minister to Mexico and asks to buy California, and they refuse to even talk to the ambassador. That was a blunder on Mexico's part, and that causes Polk to take some action. Polk orders a 2,000-man army to the banks of the Rio Grande. Texas has an undefined border, and Texas thought its border extended to the Rio Grande, so we marched troops down there. We have two armies, 6,000 Mexicans on one side and 2,000 U.S. troops under a man named Zachary Taylor on the north bank. Polk, though, runs out of patience in May of 1846, and he asks Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. Suddenly word comes into Washington that the Mexicans had crossed the river and attacked Taylor's army. Polk writes his message to Congress, and it is actually a precipitating incident that made it and it has a precipitating incident that makes it not like the War of 1812. Congress declares war then in 1846 on Mexico, and neither the United States nor Mexico tried to avoid the trouble that much. And in these days, actually, the U.S. and Mexico were pretty evenly matched. So in the summer of 1846, the first thing the United States did was attack and capture California. The commanding general of the U.S. Army is a man named Winfield Scott, who was brilliant and daring enough to land an army on the eastern coast of Mexico and then actually march straight on into Mexico City. Everybody in Europe thought that we were stupid, but a few months later we did capture Mexico City, and we had done this by September of 1847. The Duke of Wellington, remember that guy who'd whooped Napoleon, actually thought that Scott was very smart. So we realized that we'd captured Mexico City, but Polk had sent a man named Nicholas Trist, a chief clerk to the State Department, to see if we could negotiate a peace treaty. And after the capture of Mexico, Polk has second thoughts and tells Trist, no, come back, talk to us. Trist wrote a 60-page letter explaining why he was going to disobey and continue to negotiate. So he's going to disobey the president. And Trist is going to succeed in negotiating the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The war did not really unify the American people, but this had become an issue with with people who were concerned with actual moral issues, concerned about slavery and its spread. And then so basically this is all going to be behind this reasoning of, well, no, we actually have to settle this. Polk, though, of course, wants all of Mexico, and this just isn't going to happen. So there was this real debate going on, what should we even be wanting? All of Mexico? Should we want just Texas? But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to be signed, and it's going to say Mexico will recognize the Rio Grande as the southern Texas border. The United States will pay Mexico $15 million, add the word million right there, for what becomes California, Nevada, and parts of present-day Utah, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. And there's going to be a promise that the United States will protect Mexican nationals living in the newly American land, but there's actually no provision there for them to let them keep their own property. So we're talking about all of these moral concerns that the nation was facing, and these moral concerns about what is going to happen with the slavery issue in the new territory is going to be articulated in the Wilmot Proviso. Now, the Wilmot Proviso never actually happens, but it was a congressional proposal forbidding slavery in all territories newly gained from Mexico. So there's going to be an attempt to pass this 3 times, and it's going to fail. Fail in 46, 47, and 48. So the very fact, though, that this idea keeps coming up over and over is important, and this is going to become the Wilmot Proviso position or the free soil position. Basically, where says when slavery exists, it can exist, but it should not be expanded. So now we have all this land, right? We have now the United States has almost expanded from sea to shining sea. We're almost done with our expansion. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves, but there is a feeling of also tremendous anxiety because this question of the territory is going to have to be settled. However, we think we have a very, very long time before the issue has to be solved because all of these states are going to take a long time to settle. What we do not know is that soon after, weeks actually after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, gold is going to be discovered in California. And then California is going to become on the fast path to statehood. So I'll leave you there with the cliffhanger for next class. I know you guys are all on pins and needles. But again, I want you to go back, look at your notes, anything that was confusing, write down so we can go over it again in class on Tuesday, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Bye.